A couple of months ago, the youngish adult group met out by the lake. We had several new people, and so we took some time to be able to get to know each other. As we were getting ready to close, I asked the question of what they were wanting or in need of spiritually, and how that might inform what we then do as a group together. More than half of the group said they were in the process of deconstructing some of the faith they had been given or taught as children, and they weren't sure how to do the reconstruction. And I see that we have a couple of youth here with us this morning, Delia and Elise. And I want to say to you that we are not a congregation that feels like you have to unthinkingly accept what we are trying to pass on to you. We always want you to be curious, and we always want you to push back where it feels like you need to push back if something that we are sharing with you sounds ridiculous. In fact, we count on you calling us out on those things. So I hope you hear that as an invitation. So I shared with the youngish adults that I think most people in this congregation have been in a kind of lifelong process of deconstruction and reconstruction, because we keep learning new things about ourselves, about the world, about Christianity in its myriad forms. So I began to think maybe we could do some of it all together as a congregation. Now, I will say we don't always want to be doing it, because we all need breaks sometimes. If you've ever done a house remodel and have lived to tell about it, you know that the deconstruction and the reconstruction can be absolutely exhausting. Sometimes you just need to sit in the house and be in it and with it and experience it as it is. Because of what's happening in our country right now, which we commonly understand, I think there's a national narrative around what is termed the religious right, meaning the Christian right, and really meaning the Christian right that has kind of subsumed politics into all of its forms, that because of what the religious right has been up to, there is some urgency to our deconstruction project. It would be easier for many of us who think of ourselves or identify as progressive Christians to just denounce the Bible, distance ourselves from anyone in that camp, or to even begin using terms that create that distance, like post-Christian. Or another option is that we can go deeper than that and remember that our goal is not to sever relationships, but to always be liberating potential, and to have a phrase that we're going to learn about today, tov meod, which means very good relationships with all of creation, including other humans. So we're going to look at our beginning story as one way to begin a congregational project of some deconstruction. So to say that the Bible is problematic is a bit of an understatement. If we're honest, most of us don't really have an idea of how to understand much of the Bible. If you've ever read through Leviticus, you could honestly say that. What sense to make of it, how to really be able to use it in our everyday spiritual lives, and probably have wrestled at one time or another with, should we give up on it, or do we really want to get better at defending it? What are we actually defending? There is simply no honest way to get around texts that have been used to cause hatred, justification for white and Christian supremacy, for the enslavement and oppression of others, for child abuse, for war, for poverty, for individualism that absolutely divides, and even for genocide. Most of us who are Christian have no idea what to do with the Hebrew Bible that portrays a violent God who cares only about the very few designated people that God has chosen. Former Episcopalian Bishop John Shelby Spong wrote an article more than 20 years ago for the Jesus Seminar titled, "A Christianity for Tomorrow." And in the article, he outlined why Christianity and Christian churches would die if we aren't willing to give up on old ideas and theology that had long since been proven to be untrue because of advances in science and research. As a Christian pastor for the last 31 years, I have to admit I have at times wondered how much longer I could in good conscience stand up and preach using a Bible that I sometimes question more than I appreciate, and that I find is usually not a helpful exposition of the experience of God and of Jesus. And I care about the experience with God and Jesus very much. One of the things I share in common with Spong is that I don't think the Bible was ever supposed to be the end-all and be-all of the God experience. Early church leaders made it that, but the irony is that words are inadequate to describe what Spong refers to as the living presence or God. The Hebrews tried to put words to it in the form of myths and laws and stories about people and tribes and kings and queens and judges and prophets. The early followers of Jesus tried to put words to it that they didn't even understand at the time. The concept of heaven, for example, was written before anyone understood that the earth is round and not flat. The concept of a Messiah was understood to be an actual king who would finally rule with equity and with care for the poor and oppressed. The theological stuff came later, and some would say was a way that the church could create dependence. It's so nice to have Hazen here and worship with us. The sound of a little baby crying is one of the best sounds, isn't it? So early on, the church created a problem and offered a solution. But I find myself at this point in my life not ready to give up on the Bible. Though I think my task as a pastor and our task as a church is to understand it as a living word, meaning something we can use as we try to understand anew the God experience, as we use it to understand anew how the divine permeates the human, as it did in Jesus. So we're going to begin at the beginning with the very act of creation. It's helpful to name how many of us have understood our creation story. Many of us were taught that God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, and that humans were created as the ultimate or the pinnacle of creation. We were taught that because we were the highest form of creation, we were given power over, dominion of the world and all of creation and creatures. That's covered in most of Genesis 1. But then there was another story about creation that also deeply influenced what many of us have been taught. Apparently, there was a perfect garden called Eden, and humans lived with God on the earth in that perfect garden. There were trees, and the humans were told not to eat of one of the trees. In a weak moment, they ate of that tree and therefore disobeyed God's command, and that's how sin and evil supposedly entered the world. And the humans were thrown out of the perfect garden because they were no longer perfect, and sin was passed on through them to all of their offspring and to us as well, and so we came to understand original sin. That understanding is crucial to the rest of the Hebrew Bible that is about the on-again, off-again relationship between God and humans. This becomes part of the designated problem, and the solution is a coming Messiah. Remember, this kind of theology developed over hundreds and hundreds of years and was made doctrine by what we now call the Catholic Church. It was the one church. Into this mix came the concept of the Hebrews as the chosen people, which the church then co-opted to mean Christians in the days of Jesus. You can see how complicated this all gets. So let's look at Genesis 1 so that we can more deeply understand what was going on in this creation myth. Maybe our understanding will help us in this reformation, this reconstruction of our theology. Some versions say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Other translations say, including the one we read from this morning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep. So there wasn't nothing there, as we've been led to believe, but what actually seems to be happening is that there was chaos and darkness, which actually means obscurity or a lack of clarity, and God worked with it. What do I mean by that? I mean, we are told that the Ruach, or the Spirit, or the wind of God hovered or brooded over it for a bit and then took the chaos and rather than destroying it, simply began to invite order and balance to it. And so on the first day, God wanted there to be light or illumination because that's who God is and how God is, the light in the midst of the chaos. And that's what happened, and God saw that the light was good, and God distinguished between light and darkness and called one day and the other night. And the story continues in this way, with God distinguishing between the waters and the sky and calling them good, and then the land and the seas and the vegetation and seeds, and then seasons and sun and moon and living creatures in the waters and on the land, and then humans that God makes in God's image. But let's get to the climax, which is not the humans per se, but God's conclusion about all of it. In the very last verse of Genesis 1, verse 31, God says, God saw everything that God had made, and indeed, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. So all through creation, everything is good. And then in the end, looking over all of it, it was very good. So something happens in this last verse that is worth paying attention to. Each new thing was good. And then all of a sudden, God said it was very good. So what does very good mean? And for that matter, what does good mean? To talk about this, I want to share with you part of a talk I heard by Lisa Sharon Harper, a scholar, author, and speaker who identifies as an evangelical Christian. She wrote a book titled The Very Good Gospel. And because she was quoted in something that I read, I was curious and I found a talk she gave on this book. I don't often seek out evangelical scholars because I don't often agree with where they end up. But she is someone who really intrigued me. She is a Black woman whose ancestors included indigenous people in Georgia and included formerly enslaved people. She tells a story about how she went on a pilgrimage that covered both the Trail of Tears with indigenous people and the civil rights movement. She learned information she had not known, and she felt the despair of her ancestors. She began to apply her evangelical version of good news to her ancestors and realized that the 4 spiritual laws and other conversion techniques she had been taught would not have been heard as good news by her people. So she went on a 13-year journey deconstructing some of her faith and seeking deeply for what good news she could find for her ancestors. And she decided to begin her journey in Genesis. So the talk she gave and the book she wrote was after this 13 years of study and searching. So one of the things she talks about is how we understand this good creation. She points out that most of us think like the Greek people thought, which was to understand that good is something that resides in the thing itself. So light is good, food is good, people are good. You get the idea. It's referring to the thing. So when Genesis says God saw it and it was good, whatever the thing was, we understand it to mean the thing itself, the light, the sky, the land, the creatures. But Dr. Harper points out that the Hebrew people who wrote these initial books would have heard it and understood it quite differently. The Hebrews understood tov, the Hebrew word that is used for good, as existing between things rather than the thing itself. So the good that God saw that first day would have been the relationship between light and dark. When we read in verse 31 that God saw everything, and indeed it was very good, which in Hebrew is tov meod, the meaning to meod is fervently, forcefully, abundantly good. But God was not making a statement about the creation of humankind as compared to everything else. For the Hebrews, God was describing the climax moment of creation, which is that all of the relationships in creation were abundantly good, fervently and abundantly good. So between God and humanity, abundantly good. Between humans and creatures, abundantly good. between humans and humans, abundantly good, between humans and land and sea, abundantly good. In other words, this is a vision for a world in which God is the ground of all being, a co-creator with all else, a world in which all of the relationships are abundantly good. Nothing was cursed by anything else, and goodness did not reside in a thing or a person or a creature, but in the relationships. Today, we might even say the system of relationships. This has two critical implications for us in terms of how we live in the world and how we relate to God, the living presence, the ground of our being. First, we have to dispel the harmful narrative related to perfection. In the conservative Christian narrative, God created the universe perfectly, and humans were a part of that perfect creation. The church has always taught this to mean without sin, typically referring to individual behavior. But then the snake tempted Eve, Eve tempted Adam, and the whole thing was ruined, and God could no longer stand the sight of them and threw them out of the garden, cursed them forever until the promised Messiah came to fruition. And of course, the promised Messiah was the perfection that we could not attain. Perfect, in part because of not being conceived by humans. So remember, this was in the days before science had shown us that both an egg and a sperm are necessary for the conception of a child. So to say that the Holy Spirit impregnated Mary seemed logical at the time, because no one would have conceived of the idea that a woman would participate in the conception of a baby, only in the birthing of. Many of us grew up being taught that we were supposed to live perfectly like Jesus, and anything less than perfection meant that we were going against God and sinning and therefore guilty. So much of the church's teaching has been on individual behavior rather than on the relationships or the tov meod in all of creation. We hold ourselves to a standard of perfection that never was, and we hold others to that standard, and we actually harm relationships by doing that. One last harmful aspect of this concept of perfection is that it falsely leads us to believe that God finished creation in the way the story goes. It completely ignores verses 26 to 31, where God says, "Let us make earth creatures, Adam and Adamah," and where God talks about all of the seeds that have so much potential. Creation is not finished, but full of potential. And the same is true for humans, who we know have evolved over millions of years. Why is that important? Because we are still evolving. And if we don't put more value on whether or not things are very good in all of our relationships with creation and creatures and the light and the dark and God and us, we will surely destroy all of it. When we value perfection more than relationship, we are doing great harm. Second, we have to reframe our notions of evil. I've touched on this before, but I want to give some more clarity. John Shelby Spong describes in A Christianity for Tomorrow that Darwin claimed that there was no perfect and finished creation, and that creation is ongoing. That means there was no perfect human creation that fell into a state of sin right at the beginning. Spong writes, human life has emerged from a single cell in the sea perhaps 4 billion years ago until it evolved into a creature who knows what it means to be separated from the natural world by the emergence of a self-consciousness that developed perhaps as recently as 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. This self-consciousness that humans have has organized life to serve the primary evolutionary need to survive. And that's what makes human existence the highest human value. This has resulted in the emergence of a radically self-centered humanity whose will to survive, no matter what the cost, is the source of what we now call evil. As you might imagine, this has implications for how we're to understand the role of Jesus. Instead of a perfect Jesus rescuing us from the hands of a wrathful God who could not stand the sight of us, Jesus calls us into our ongoing creation as we seek God, the living presence, the ground of our being. Just as creation is ongoing, so is humanity. Another way of understanding evil is to say that evil is whatever disrupts the tov meod, the very goodness of the relationships between all of creation. Imagine what our world would look like, what our current political situation would look like, if Christian people focused on restoring relationships between us and God, us and all of humanity, us and the created world. Instead, again, what has been termed the religious right, this movement in our country has focused on the issue of abortion, not on war, which, by the way, kills far more people, not on the death penalty, which is state-sanctioned murder. They have focused on the issue of abortion in order to amass power to gain greater control over women, over people of color, over all people who do not identify as Christian. This is the definition of evil as it relates to the tov meod of our beginning story in Genesis. There is one final theme in this first chapter that needs to be highlighted because I know you would walk away wondering about it. Have you ever wondered why God says, "Let there be," all through this first chapter? Have you wondered why God needed to speak anything or to whom God was speaking? In his book, The Liberating Path of the Hebrew Prophets, Rabbi Nahum Ward Lev writes this: throughout Genesis 1, God is addressing the natural world. On the first day, God addresses the emptiness and chaos that preceded creation. In later days, God says, "Let there be," to the world that God has created up until then. We recognize that with God's work with creation, it's a process of call and response. God does not create in some outside, imperial, or forceful way by imposing an external will on passive creation. Rather, using the invitation of words, God animates the created world on a journey to liberate its potential, to respond as a person responds in dialogue. God calls out and thereby energizes the potential for transformation. Creation responds by bringing forth a new and more differentiated and interrelated order of being. In the coming weeks, we're going to continue to explore what it means that from the very beginning of the creation stories, God's desire is to liberate the potential of creation and creatures. Liberation didn't just start with the Exodus event, but was right there in the very beginning of the story of the beginning. So in these coming weeks, may we in some ways experience liberation from something, whatever that is for each of us, and liberation toward something else, ideally something more free, that will call forth in us our potential. Amen.